So today I'm going to be starting off talking about introduction to random fields. And so who we are, the four of us have been working on the sdmTMB tool and related products over the last couple of years. This is really led by Sean Anderson, who's at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Also Lewis Barnett from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center based in Seattle. Felina English, who is also based in Nanaimo with Fisheries Oceans Canada, and myself. I'm based at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, also like Lewis. And so over the next 2 weeks, we've kind of split the material up so that, like I said, in week one, today, we're going to be describing some of these basic models and walking through code with you. During session 1 and session 2, we'll hopefully have you be able to install sdmTMB yourself, and then coming back next week, we'll review some of these more complicated models. Each day, we have about, say, an hour and a half to 2 hours of material to kind of work through. We have some deliberate breaks that we'll be including there to just give everybody a break, but also to include time for responding to questions, et cetera. And if you have any questions, like I said, please enter those in the Google Doc. You can ask them during the break, and then we'll kind of have a discussion session that's more free form at the end to answer any additional questions. Okay, so why are we here? Often in a lot of the fisheries and ecology data that we're collecting, we often have spatial attributes associated with that data. And so in an ideal world, we can also collect a lot of spatial covariates, and we could put them into maybe a generalized linear model or mixed effects model. And those covariates in the ideal world would explain the data perfectly. And so when we took the residuals from that model and plotted them over space, here just X and Y, we could see that there's no real patterning over space. These residuals are spatially uncorrelated. And the model is, those covariates that we included do a great job at explaining what's going on with the population. I think in reality, though, what we often have is a situation where we don't have the perfect covariates that explain why populations are moving around in space or changing the way that they are. And we often have this residual spatial autocorrelation. And so in this case, we have clear spatial patterning where there's a patch of negative residuals in red and patches of positive residuals in blue. So the model doesn't do a great job explaining this additional spatial variation, and it really necessitates a more complex model to be able to describe this behavior. And so what we really need is to include a wiggly or smooth surface for approximating all of the things in the model that we don't have covariates for. And so we often include refer to these maybe as hidden variables or latent variables, but there's some process that we're not quite measuring perfectly. We need to account for that imperfection. And so there's several different approaches for modeling these kind of spatial surfaces. There are approaches using MGCV. So a lot of you may be familiar with fitting GAMs in 1 or 2 dimensions. And those are the first approach. The second approach are using random fields and the stochastic partial differential equation approach. And so that's a mouthful, I realize. And that SPDE approach is really the approach that we'll be talking about today. The SPDE approach and MGCV or GAMs differ slightly in that when we use the SPD approach, we can explicitly estimate parameters that are related to the spatial covariance. So understanding how the covariance between 2 points decays as a function of distance is something that we can get out of the SPD approach, but we can't get out of most of the GAMs that we might fit. There's a really great paper for folks that might not be aware of it, led by Dave Miller in 2020. And what Dave did was really show the equivalence between these approaches. So these are 2 different ways that are common to approach this type of problem. You can rewrite the SPD approach as a smooth and fit it with MGCV, and Dave includes code for how to do that. So if you're comfortable with one of these approaches over the other, by all means use it. Today we'll be largely talking about the SPD approach though. And so I briefly referred to the idea of this spatial covariance, and in a lot of different kind of spatial applications in fisheries and ecology, we might need to choose some covariance function. Today we'll be really only using the Matern covariance, which is associated with the SPD approach, and it's extremely flexible. And so it has several parameters. One of them is this new parameter that's illustrated on this slide. And a nu can take on a wide variety of shapes. So when nu is 0.5, it can take on kind of the pink line, which is an exponential covariance function. As nu is cranked up and goes to infinity, it can take on a Gaussian covariance function, which is more similar to what the purple line might represent. And so it's extremely flexible, can take on a wide variety of shapes. So the next thing we need to talk about are predictive process models. And so in an ideal world, what we can do is we have that spatial field, or we had that spatial residual pattern that I showed, and we can think about trying to estimate all of those points separately as random effects. And that is certainly one approach for handling these types of problems, but it becomes computationally very challenging if you have more than 50 or certainly 100 points, in that estimating those random effects jointly becomes very computationally challenging. And so instead of estimating those values at the location of the observations, what we choose to do instead is use these predictive process models, which instead of taking the values at our observations, we're going to choose a random subset of points in that space, estimate the values of the surface of that space, and those values that we're estimating or approximating the function or that surface at are often called knots, or you might see them called vertices or control points, depending on what kind of subfield you're reading papers in. But when we estimate the values of the function or that field at those knots, we can then use our Matern covariance function to interpolate from the knots to our values of interest at the actual locations of our observed data. So what this means in a one-dimensional setting, which people might be more familiar with, is if we think about kind of what's going on with a GAM in one dimension, our red points represent the actual observations or data, and we want to try to approximate the overall trajectory or trend that in this data through time. And we can choose to estimate the values of this function at a number of knots or vertices, which are represented as the vertical dashed lines. In the top panel here, we have a lot of vertical dashed lines. We can see that the surface or our function is very wiggly and does a better job approximating our data. In the lower panel, we see that we only have 5 knots or vertices, and so we do a much coarser job. That function, though, is also much more smooth compared to the top panel. So choosing the knots and where those knots are really affects how wiggly or what the shape of this overall function looks like. This is the one-dimensional version. Today we'll be exclusively talking about the two-dimensional spatial version. And so when we, moving on to thinking about kind of different types of spatial data, I think there's 3 main types that we might run across. There are lattice data, and so these are gridded data that might be something like interpolated sea surface temperature that's projected onto 1 kilometer grids in the ocean. We might have aerial data, and so these are often blocks that are polygons, maybe from shapefiles that represent different regions. And they might be, if you're focused on, say, if you want to look at, say, fishing records by different catch areas, you might have different catch areas on the west coast of the United States. And those could be thought of as aerial data, in that they're different in size. You have different blocks that neighbor other blocks, but it's not on a grid. And then the third kind of data is georeference data. And so this is data where every observation is associated with a unique latitude and longitude. This is data that is often the result of many of the surveys that NOAA or Fisheries and Oceans Canada do. These might be trawl survey data. They might be marine mammal or bycatch observations. These locations can be unique, so every observation has a unique latitude, longitude, or they might be data that's associated with stations. And so I'm explicitly thinking about surveys like CalCoffee, where the same surveys or where the survey is repeated over time at the same stations across years. And so I think, as I've just to kind of review what I was saying earlier, we care about the relationship of space, especially in thinking about patterns that I was showing with the residuals, in that data that are more closer together in space tend to be more similar. And so that's essentially what spatial autocorrelation is. So we assume that distance between 2 points and the covariance between them can be described with a spatial covariance function. We're going to be using exclusively the Matern function. And it's also important to think that covariance might also be changing spatially. And so that just in terms of some of the language that we might use to describe that, we might refer to that covariance as being isotropic, in which case the covariance with respect to latitude is the same with respect to longitude, or the covariance might be anisotropic, in which case the covariance in the latitudinal direction is different from the longitudinal direction. And for the purposes of today's material especially, we'll be exclusively talking about isotropic covariance, but the methods and tools that we'll be talking about can also use anisotropic covariance. So next, we're going to be talking about introducing random fields. And random fields graphically might look like this, where we have a spatial pattern through time. These might be residuals from our model, or a surface that's estimated uniquely for each of 6 different time slices. And so there's a number of ways to describe the random fields. These Muppets are all from courtesy of Sean, but kind of the really mathy way to describe these random fields are that they are stochastic processes that arise as these multi-dimensional vectors or points on a complicated manifold. And so that's the math way to say what's going on. We also think about these random fields as 2-dimensional Gaussian processes. And so just as I was showing the example with the GAM and the smooth surface, we might also assume that the collection of values of our spatial field at the knots or the vertices are a realization from a multivariate normal distribution with some covariance function that we specify. And so that's the second interpretation. And third, we can also think about these as being wiggly surfaces that are means to approximate the spatial or spatiotemporal correlation that we observe in our data. So this is a way to account for the latent or unobserved variables, as I described on the first couple of slides. And as a bonus, instead of fitting a GAM, what we get out of this are these covariance parameter estimates. So that looking at the shape of what that covariance or how that covariance declines over space, and the distance at which 2 points in space might be completely uncorrelated. That's also referred to as the range of the covariance function. So there's many ways to simulate random fields in R. There's lots of different packages out there, and I would encourage everyone to try to take 5 minutes to explore with one of these packages, not necessarily today, but maybe over the next week. There are, as I said, lots of different packages out there that do this in slightly different ways. The package sdmTMB includes a simulate function that allows us to simulate these fields for univariate responses. And so this is a function that's really powerful. I'd encourage everybody to also play with some examples, and we'll talk about some examples today. So when we think about this, as I think that one of the things that you can do in playing with that sdmTMB simulate function explore different parameters of the range of the spatial covariance. So the range, remember, is how quickly, it's basically the distance at which 2 points are uncorrelated in space. And so we can play with the range parameter. We can also play with the actual variance parameter that describes how large in magnitude those deviations are. And so in the SDMTMB universe, we refer to that variance or the standard deviation as sigma O. And so Sean will talk about that later. But what I've essentially shown here are 2 sets of plots where we've faceted by 2 different values of the range. In the top row, we have the range being low, and the top and at the bottom is the range is higher at 0.5. And then left to right, we have weak values of, or small values of, that spatial variability on the left and high values on the right. And what we see is that, I think a couple things are standing out here. First, just in terms of thinking about that spatial variability or the magnitude of those deviations, as sigma O increases from 0.05 on the left to 0.1 on the right, what we see are these values on the right that are much larger in magnitude. So we get more positive values and more negative values because that variability is increasing. So you can think about it as the spatial surface that we're trying to estimate is just becoming peaky, more peaky as we go from the left to the right and crank up that spatial variance. Similarly, we can think about the spatial range parameter. And so on the bottom row, the spatial range is large, which means that when the spatial range is large, it means that 2 points that are further in space are still remain correlated in, they remain correlated with one another. As we crank that down and go to the top row, we can see that this smooth surface on the bottom that is much more dominated in the central region, say, by these negative values. As we crank down that distance at which points are correlated from 0.5 to 0.1, we get you can see that correlation falling off, and so we get much more independence in spatial patterning kind of around that region. And so that's 2 of the important parameters that we can play with. I would encourage everybody to explore this more kind of on your own. So complicating matters, I think that, in addition to having the spatial variance and the range to play with, in a perfect world, we also would not have observation or measurement errors to deal with. But in reality, I think that we often do in our surveys. They're imperfect, and so a third parameter to think about is the importance of observation error variance. And so in this case, we can think about simulating data with that SDMTMB simulate function. And in kind of the extreme case, we have a situation here where our observation error is much larger in magnitude than that spatial variance. And so in this case, any spatial patterning that we might see or that might be actually occurring is really corrupted by the fact that we have really noisy observations here. And the result is that what was once a spatial, kind of a smooth spatial pattern looks like random noise. And so we have big red points close to big blue points and vice versa. This is a situation where we can crank down that variability in the observation error. And this is a case where the observation error is equal to that spatial variance. We can see more of the spatial process here in that we get, kind of, oh, I'm sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. Sorry. So here we get the same kind of spatial patterning, but there are still cases though where you can look at the data and see that things are not completely spatially correlated, because we still get really large, or values that are large in magnitude close to values that are weaker in magnitude, and so there's still some noise in this data. And then going on to the kind of the third extreme is a case where we have observation error variance being much smaller than spatial variability. So in this case, we have a much more smooth surface. This is the original surface that we're simulating that's uncorrupted by observation noise. Okay, so if we want to estimate these random fields with a model, we often have a case where we have georeference data. And so georeference data, as I said, involves observations that have corresponding latitude and longitude. In a lot of the data that I work with and that I think that all of us work with, we have data sets with thousands of more observations. It's computationally very challenging to estimate these. And so we have to use this spatial approximation as I was describing. The sdmTMB approach uses an approach from INLA. For anybody who's used INLA, INLA is the integrated nested Laplace approximation. And for any users of VAST, which is another tool that Jim Thorson has developed, this is basically the same approach that VAST uses. There's a huge library of books, many of which are free online that you can learn more about INLA with, and I've linked to that here. So INLA and the SPD approach, what we want to do here is, the SPDE approach creates a Gaussian random field with the Maturin covariance function, and so that's really why we use the Maturin covariance. And instead of working with the covariance matrices directly, what this approach allows us to do is instead model these very large and sparse precision matrices. So a sparse matrix being a matrix that is mostly zeros, and the precision matrix is also the inverse of the covariance matrix. So the covariance matrix may not include a lot of zeros, but it's inefficient to work with. This approach to working with precision matrices is much more efficient. INLA is a software tool that will kind of perform the data wrangling necessary for creating the inputs for the SPDE estimation. And INLA will also allow you to perform estimation. And so I think if you're fitting, most of the kind of common GLMMs or spatiotemporal models that we'll be talking about today, you could do them equivalently in INLA. INLA is a little bit different in that it uses the Laplace approximation to do Bayesian estimation, and it involves priors. We're not going to be doing that here. We'll be using sdmTMB to use template model builder, or TMB, for maximum likelihood estimation. There's a number of really good papers that include all this material that are linked on the wiki for the sdmTMB page. One of the papers here by Finn Lindgren is a really good approach for describing that linkage between those Gaussian fields and the SPDE approach.
Hey, Eric.
Yep.
This is Lewis. Sorry, we did have one question in the Google Doc about the spatial range, whether it's a parameter that's estimated or a property of the data. And so I was pointing out that it is estimated within the model. And I may not have phrased it very well, but in practice, it seems like, while it's informed by the data, it doesn't change by a large magnitude, given like a low to moderate change in the properties of the data. Is that a good way of phrasing it, or maybe you can put a finer point on that?
I think we'll talk about that more, I think, in some of the examples that we'll talk about. It's a good question. I think the spatial range is outputted as it's estimated as a derived thing in the model, and it is it's probably it's complicated. It's a function of what kind of data is being used, how many data points, whether it's a spatial or spatiotemporal, or exactly how the model is being set up. And so I think it's probably, we'll give some examples. The easiest thing to do is just talk about it in a second with some examples. Okay, so I think, as I said before, when I was talking about the one-dimensional setting with the GAM, where we were dividing the range of our data up into these knots or vertices and estimating a function at those values, we need to do the same thing in 2 dimensions. And so this is kind of what the INLA or SPD approach is doing. And so we need to create what's called a mesh. And so a mesh is this surface that's outlined here as a polygon that includes these different triangles. The triangles are important because if we know the values of the values basically of this surface at the vertices of these triangles, then for any points that don't occur on the vertices, we can interpolate between the three values you know, on the triangle to interpolate what the value is of what the value of the field is at the locations of the actual points. And so constructing this mesh is often one of the more complicated decisions and you know, kind of parts of the whole pipeline for fitting models with sdmTMB. There's a number of kind of guidelines for doing this, and there's you know, I think that we generally would create different meshes for each data set. I think if we are, you know, using sdmTMB for, say, creating standardized indices of abundance that are being fed into stock assessments, I think that it's reasonable to probably use a similar mesh for many of the same species that are caught in the same survey. But for other approaches where you want to look at you know, a given species from a given survey and compare that to another species from a different survey, each of those different analyses probably needs a unique mesh. And so that's you know, that's something that needs to be done thoughtfully. There's a number of rules of thumb for doing that. I think that, you know, some of the more obvious ones are that as we increase the number of triangles in our mesh, we're going to get better spatial predictions of that smooth surface that we're trying to estimate. A downside of adding more triangles, though, is that it increases computation time. One way around that is to add a border to our mesh, and so we have our kind of our survey region of interest that we want to estimate with a high resolution mesh, and surround that with a coarser border of coarser triangles to reduce the overall complexity of the mesh as a whole. We can define the minimum edge size between triangles to avoid the meshes becoming too fine, and so that's an important parameter. In general, as a rule of thumb, we want fewer vertices than data points, and so if you have a survey that has 200 observations, you probably want to have a mesh with fewer than 200 data points to avoid overfitting. And then the overall mesh size needs to be smaller than a spatial range. I think that one of the general issues of both the SPD approach and other spatial models like GAMs is obviously, if we're trying to predict beyond the ranges of our data, it's going to be a general challenge and problem for the model. So just as we wouldn't try to you know, extrapolate beyond the ranges of our data with a GAM, we can't use create a giant mesh of the entire Northeast Pacific Ocean if our survey domain is only the West Coast of the United States. There's a number of really great examples that are also linked to how to build meshes in the wiki. There's a book that I've linked here and some examples of really what you don't want to do in making a mesh, but I think it's worth putting a lot of thought into how to do this, and in an ideal world, probably compare some different mesh configurations when you're fitting the model, just to make sure that your models are robust to the choice of mesh. If you want to build your own mesh, there's a number of ways to do this outside of sdmTMB. You can use the custom functions in INLA. So there's an INLA mesh 2D function to let you specify a large number of arguments and configure this. There's a Shiny app called Mesh Builder in INLA that will also generate the R code for constructing your mesh. We will talk about next week ways to make these meshes more complicated, so including things like barriers or coastlines or islands with shapefiles. And again, there's a lot of great references out there and books on INLA and the approach that I've linked to here. So to simplify all this construction of the mesh, the sdmTMB software has a make mesh function to basically construct a mesh without a lot of the decisions about individual parameters. And just to highlight this, we are going to construct a mesh, and the only argument that we are going to be specifying is the cutoff distance at which 2 points are no longer considered to be independent. So in this first case, we've set, for our example data set here, I've set the cutoff distance to 50 kilometers. And so this creates, a fairly coarse mesh, one that's likely too coarse. We can crank that cutoff distance down to 25. We increase the number of triangles, and then again we can crank that cutoff distance down to 10. And so I think as we decrease that cutoff distance, we're going to get more triangles, which will lead to a better prediction in terms of a smoother overall spatial surface that we're estimating for that spatial random field. But it's also going to have a trade-off of increased complexity, leading to more computation time. And I think with that, I'm going to end it and stop sharing my screen and let Sean take over for the next section.
Do we want to take any questions on those slides first?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. Lewis, are there any good questions in the Google Doc?
Yeah, there's one coming in just now. Does the mesh affect only prediction estimates, or also parameter estimates?
All of the above. I think, one of the trade-offs is that, as we'll see in some of these other examples, if you have especially if you have a covariate that is somewhat confounded with space. And so I think about, you think about for a really large domain, maybe temperature is warmer in the north than in the south, or for something like depth, maybe there's a longitudinal break where depth and longitude are really correlated. So the spatial surface can explain some of the variability that would be otherwise attributed to those covariates of interest. And so I think it absolutely will affect other parameters. So the choice of resolution of the mesh and how that mesh is configured absolutely will also affect those other parameters, especially when there is confounding between any of the covariates and space.
Great. And another question, in the mesh on the last slide that you just showed, they're wondering why there were triangles around the border of the data outside of the range of observations.
Yeah, so that is called, that's the border of the mesh, and then that's an approach for increasing the overall efficiency of I guess we could have it's basically an approach for increasing the overall efficiency, decreasing the overall number of the triangles by putting coarser triangles around the border of the actual surveyed area of interest. So we're not necessarily making predictions for those outside intervals, but we're just trying to make things more efficient.
The theory is also that you're trying to reduce edge effects. So you're estimating the spatial covariance going over the edge, so that I think there's some funny things that can happen at the very edge of the mesh. There's some literature on INLA about that.
Particularly if those values are extreme, right?
So you do want your mesh to go a little bit beyond the data, and as Erica said, there's the general theory is that you don't need as high resolution when you're going outside the data around the edges, but you want to extend a bit beyond the edges of the data.
Okay, now there's a question again about mesh resolution, mesh size. So that in the different examples have different mesh resolutions. Some have even triangle size, I guess, where all the sides are of equal length. And so they're asking, is that a property of a good mesh?
Not necessarily. It really, yeah. So like, it really depends on the data. I think that when I'm especially thinking about like the tree example that we'll talk about in a little bit, if you have data that is not uniformly collected in space, then it doesn't really make sense to have a mesh that has equal distribution of triangles with equal sides necessarily. So that'll be an example where we have some kind of funny shaped triangles around edges of missing data. And similarly, I think that if you had areas in a survey where you had more dense data, you would have denser triangles, smaller triangles in that region.
I'd also just add that in general, mesh construction seems to be partly an art over a science still, and there's lots of varying guidelines out there, and I don't think all of these questions have sort of been fully resolved yet in the literature. But it's certainly probably a good thing to have more smaller triangles around places where you have more data, where you need more fine scale resolution.
Couple more question.
Lisa has a good question. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I was just going to say one in the chat about sort of order of operations, and I think we'll get to that a little bit in the next set of slides. But it is a good point because our workflow for SDMTMB is doing the model fitting, then doing some work on diagnostics, looking at residuals, et cetera, and predictions as a separate step, whereas other like VAST and some other related packages sort of tend to do it all in the same step. And yep. We have another question in the Google Doc. If you have data collected across space and time, should you make a new mesh for each year or base your mesh off of all of the data? And the answer is use the same mesh for all the data.
We should probably, in the interest of time, move on to Sean's next section here. I'll help answer questions in the chat or in the Google Doc too, if folks have more questions.
All right, thanks, Eric. I'm going to talk a little bit, just introducing the SDMTMB R package, and then we'll get into some examples. So SDMTMB is something I started back in 2018 or 19. I wanted a tool that was nice to work with and satisfied a number of our needs for modeling our survey data. It was initially part of this groundfish data analysis report where we plot out all the data for over 100 groundfish species in BC. And specifically, this was to create the spatial maps that you see in the bottom left here, which is our survey data, and also to do some index standardization as part of the top left panels. And there was some functionality that you could have done this in INLA. INLA can be challenging to work with, and there was some functionality in INLA that isn't available, like dealing with anisotropy, so spatial correlation being different in different directions, and there was some functionality that wasn't available in VAST at the time. So created this package SDMTMB, and it's sort of evolved since then. And we think that SDMTMB is a fairly user-friendly R package for modeling spatial processes. And some of the highlights of why we think it's useful is that it has a familiar syntax to widely used functions and packages, like the GLM function in R, or the MGCV GAM functions, or especially GLMMTMB, which is quite heavily modeled after. And it performs fast marginal maximum likelihood estimation via template model builder, or TMB, and is widely applicable to many species distribution models, stock assessment, bycatch models, and so on that have spatially referenced data. And if it wasn't clear, the name SDMTMB comes from species distribution modeling in TMB, often called SDMs. And installing SDMTMB currently, it's only on GitHub. We should have it on CRAN very soon, but because it's on GitHub, you'll have to have a C++ compiler installed so you can build the TMB model. So if you're on Windows, that means installing RTools. And if you are on Linux, it means hopefully you know what you're doing there, but you're going to have a compiler installed. On the Mac, you can use Xcode select install, You can Google that if you need more help, but you put that on the terminal and we'll install compilers. And then you can run install GitHub from the remotes or the DevTools package. Dependencies equals true. That just installs a number of other optional packages that are helpful for actually running models like R-INLA. So that's an important component. And when this is on CRAN, this should be considerably simpler. You'll just be able to run install.packages, sdmTMB. As one warning, the R-INLA package is quite large and it's not on CRAN and it can be slow to install and sometimes it can time out while you are installing. So if you're having problems with installing because R-INLA is giving you problems, you can go directly to the R-INLA site, install R-INLA separately first, and then try installing sdmTMB. So the general sdmTMB workflow, it was set up to be quite modular, so you could do these individual steps separately and pass objects from one to the next, sort of in a way that you might work with a GLMM in GLMMTMB or LME4. So first you start by preparing the data, and that might mean converting your spatial coordinates into an equal distance projection, which we'll talk about next. Maybe scaling your covariates so that parameter estimates are a reasonable size, and so on. Constructing a mesh. Eric started touching on that, and I'll show you how we can do that quickly in SDMTMB. We fit the model. We inspect the model in various ways and criticize the model, perhaps realize that it's not fitting the way we had hoped. Maybe compare models, refit the model. We can predict from the model, and then we can calculate various derived quantities from the predictions or the model. And there's functions that help with each of these steps. And you'll be seeing all of these functions throughout the examples that are coming up right after. So the first stage in terms of preparing the data, getting into constant distance coordinates, you need a projection that preserves constant distance because we're estimating this range parameter, which is the distance at which two data points are effectively independent, and it's in the units of your coordinates. So you need distance to be constant throughout your study region. For regional analyses, UTMs work well for this, and there is a helper function, add UTM columns in SDMTMB, that will help do this using the SF package. You can also convert to UTMs using whatever spatial tools you want, such as functions directly from the SF or the SP packages. Here's an example of just using that add UTM columns. I created a data frame with some latitudes and longitudes. And by default, it guesses at what the UTM zone should be, gives you a link so you can verify to make sure that it guessed at the right place in the world. And then it adds columns, default column names of X and Y. An important thing to note here is that UTMs are usually in meters, but if your coordinate system is in meters, then your range parameters can be really, really, really big, and that can cause estimation problems. And so usually by default, we work in kilometers so that the range parameter is in a reasonable space. You know, perhaps if you were modeling some really small experiment with quadrats, maybe meters would make sense, but you need to think about the units so that your range parameter is of a reasonable size, not way too big. So once we've created a constant distance, there was a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. It's relevant to, especially to
Yeah.
Alaska. They're asking whether this function accommodates the anti-meridian line.
This function does not do anything fancy with the anti-meridian line. Yeah, if you may need to do your own conversion outside. I think by default it's just taking the UTM zone in the middle of your region and using that. You can also supply the UTM zone, or you can convert the coordinates yourself outside and provide them. So once we have some kind of constant distance coordinates we want to work with as columns in our data set, we could create the mesh using R-INLA, which has a whole lot of options and functions to work with. There's also a shortcut function called make mesh in SDMTMB that has two options. One is using a k-means algorithm. So this uses a clustering algorithm to figure out where to put the knots based on the location of the data points in space. This is the approach taken in VAST. One thing I'll point out is that it's sensitive to the seed argument. So the random seed argument affects exactly how the knots are located. VAST actually does an iterative thing to try and find the best location of the knots, but that is one option. We've tended to use this cutoff option more frequently, the second option, which specifies the minimum allowed distance between the knots or vertices. And alternatively, as I've said, you can build any mesh you want and supply it to the mesh argument in make mesh. And as Eric mentioned, the size of the mesh has the single largest impact on the fitting speed. And so it's important to think about the resolution of this mesh and perhaps to start with fairly coarse meshes. The cutoff is in the units of X and Y. So here's an example where we have data on a scale from 0 to 1, because we're just using the random uniform function. And we pass it our X and Y column names, and we tell it the cutoff. So here, 0.1 units on a scale from 0 to 1. If we look at the $ mesh, $n element, we can see that there are 92 nodes or vertices in our mesh, and there's a helper plot function for our object, which creates what we see at the bottom. So we can visualize our mesh quickly. And we'll come back to that for each of the examples, because every single time you fit the model, we need to construct the mesh first. When we're actually fitting the model, the main function in sdmTMB is also called sdmTMB, and it's set up, I think, fairly similarly to the GLMMTMB function. What I've shown here are probably the most common arguments that you'll work with and that we'll be working with throughout this morning. So we have a formula as the first argument, and data, the mesh that we just talked about. The data is just a data frame. We have an optional time argument for the column that has the time if this is a spatiotemporal model. We have a family. We'll talk about that in a sec. We have arguments for what to do with any spatial or spatiotemporal random fields. We have silent that tells it whether or not to print optimization information as it's fitting. And you can see this, help for this, and many other arguments and descriptions in the question mark sdmTMB for the function. And so the first component is the formula, and it uses this formula interface that I think would be familiar to you if you've used GLMMs before, or GLMs in R. So you can use it to specify any fixed effects and optionally random intercepts. So the first example here is just our response is Y and our predictor is X1. And we also have an implicit intercept. We also allow you to construct smoothers through the MGCV package. So the second one adds a smoother for the X2 covariate. And the third example here adds a random intercept by group G, G being a column in the data. So the smoothers, I think, are quite powerful and useful. And you can pass in most smoothers that MGCV can parse. So the first one we showed before is just a smoother for X. The second one is specifying the basis dimension. So there's a default basis dimension that's higher than 5, and a lower value here will limit the overall possible complexity of the smoother and also increase the computational speed. The third one down has a bivariate smoother for the X and Y covariates. So it's a two-dimensional smoother. The fourth one down has X1, so a smoother for X1 that varies by X2. And if X2 is a factor, then it's a totally different smooth. And if X2 is continuous, then X1 sort of changes according to X2. And you can also do other fancy things like these cyclic smoothers with the basis of CC and 12 knots, which you might use if you were 12 basis dimensions if you were talking about months. Anyways, if you're familiar with MGCV, you can pass in most of the MGCV smoothers into the formula. And these are penalized smoothers, so it figures out the degree of wiggliness that makes sense in the smoothers. You can also do other common things you might do with formulas in R. So you can do things like use the I to protect in the formula depth squared. Otherwise, it would think that that was the depth interacting with depth, which isn't what we mean here. So that would be a linear effect for depth, and then the quadratic component. Or we could have used the poly function to get that same sort of quadratic polynomial shape. And we can omit the intercept using -1 or 0. And here I'm adding a factor for year. So these are all just standard base R formula notation. There's also a couple other special options that are built in that we've used in some research. One is a breakpoint function. So it has this hockey stick shape. It works for a single covariate. You can add other covariates, but only one covariate can have the breakpoint. So here, temperature, here catch point effort might increase up to some point at which, after which it is a CPUE does not change with temperature. And it's estimating both the height of that flat component, where the break is, and the slope of the sloped component. And there's also logistic functions. So this is getting a logistic shape as the relationship between temperature and CPUE. So that's the formulas. If we get into families and links, we can fit most of the families and maybe some fairly non-standard families as well. Most of the families that are in GLMMTMB are also available in SDMTMB. So that includes things like the Gaussian, gamma, binomial, Poisson, beta. There's a student T distribution. There's a Tweedy distribution that I'll talk about in a sec. There are two negative binomial distributions, and there's a truncated negative binomial distribution that Eric will talk about in an example in a sec. So that starts from 1 and up and doesn't have zeros. And all of these have link arguments as well. And you can see documentation in SDMTMB families. So a quick aside on the Tweedy, which I think is quite a useful distribution for a lot of the data that we tend to work with in marine sciences and in fisheries. So it's useful for when you have positive continuous data with zeros, such as biomass density per unit effort, or even just biomass density, where you could have no biomass density for a given sample. And it has two parameters, dispersion parameter, well, more than two parameters, but two parameters that allow for a wide variety of shapes. Dispersion and power parameter. It also has a mean parameter. And to show an example of some of those shapes here at the bottom here, we've got the top one, the dispersion parameter phi is 0.1, and in the bottom one, the dispersion parameter has gotten larger. And in the bottom panel there, you'll see that there's a bunch of zeros that are stacking up, and we have positive continuous values. So that's the kind of data that we often see, say, in trawl survey data with biomass density. Also referred to as the compound Poisson gamma distribution. So if we get into the spatial model components, this is where SDMTMB sort of deviates from what you might see in LME4 or GLMMTMB. As Eric said, a spatial field can be thought of as a spatial intercept. Basically, it's a wiggly spatial process that is constant in time. And then the spatiotemporal field represents separate fields that are estimated for each time slice, which are possibly correlated with each other. So it's a wiggly spatial process that changes through time. And if you click on this link and you go to the model description in the vignette for the package, all of this is sort of written out in math.
Hey, Sean.
Yep.
Before we move on with the fields, there was a question about if there are guidelines to help choose the K parameter for smoothers.
So generally, you shouldn't have to specify the K parameter because it's penalizing the wiggliness. So unless you want to make sure that it can't be too wiggly, you can just not specify the K, use whatever the default algorithm is in MGCV, and it will determine the wiggliness. But there's certainly cases where you might set the K because you don't want it to look too wiggly. Maybe you want to make sure that it's constrained to something that's roughly quadratic, so you might set K equals 3. There's other cases where perhaps the model won't converge, and so you might lower the default K value so that it's estimating fewer parameters and it'll converge better. But Yeah, that's basically what I was saying. This is just selecting the sort of upper limit on the basis dimension, but it's penalizing the smoother itself to figure out the wiggliness. So in addition to the sort of standard model fitting arguments we've talked about before, now we're getting into the spatial and spatiotemporal fields. So by default, sdmTMB estimates a spatial field. So by default, the spatial argument is set to on, can also be set to true. It does the same thing. But we could turn it off if we wanted to not fit the random fields, and then we would have a straight GLM or GLMM that would totally match anything else you would get in R. So why might you not estimate a spatial field? Well, one, maybe just for troubleshooting, or if there's the shared process across time slices isn't of interest, or if you think that the spatiotemporal variability completely dwarfs the magnitude of the spatial variation, or perhaps if it's confounded with other parameters that you're fitting in the model and you can't estimate both at the same time. But usually you're probably going to have a spatial random field if you're fitting these types of models. So spatiotemporal fields can be turned on or off and turned into various forms. And to include a spatiotemporal field, first we have to have data collected in time, and then we just have to specify what column in the data specifies the time element. So here, this is saying the year column in data specifies the time. And we need to specify a structure for the spatiotemporal fields. And the default is what you see here, IID, which refers to independent fields. And I'll show you a visual of that in a sec. But the types are off, so don't estimate them. IID, where they're independent. RW for a random walk, or AR1, where they're first order autoregressive correlated. So if we look at a visual of that, this is independent spatiotemporal field. So I've got 6 time slices, and then there's this random field that is independent every single year. And on the other hand, AR1, and I think this is AR1 with a correlation of 0.8 roughly. Here we can see that the hot spots and the cool spots sort of evolve through time as you go from the time steps 1 to 6. So they change a bit, but there's an evolution over time. And the random walk is the AR1 with the correlation fixed at 1. So every year starts at where it was last year, plus a completely independent deviation. Why might you include spatiotemporal fields? Well, if the data, first of all, if the data are collected in both space and time, and there are latent spatial processes that vary through time. So that, if we're talking about the ocean, that could be the effect of water temperature on fish abundance if temperature wasn't in the model. But it really represents all the missing variables that vary through time. So even if you had the effect of water temperature, if you plotted out your residuals, like how Eric started off the first set of slides, typically you would see correlation in every single year if you plotted out your residuals in space. And that's because there's all sorts of other variables. Maybe you included temperature, but there's also salinity, and there's also predators and prey, and there's also pH. There's all sorts of other factors that are affecting where things are in space. And so this can suck up all those latent variables. And why would a field be independent versus random walk or AR1? Well, the question is, do we expect the hotspots to be independent with each time slice or to adapt slowly over time? And we can also estimate this and check. If we tried an AR1 model and the correlation was 0, then we basically have the same model as the independent model, but we're estimating an extra parameter. So after we've fit, there's all sorts of functions for inspecting and criticizing the model, for summarizing the model, for predicting from the model, and those are going to be covered in the examples that we're going to talk about next. So there's a predict function, a residuals function, a print function, a tidy function, a get index function. And just to quickly point out, the object that comes back from sdmTMB is of class sdmTMB, and it's in R speak a S3 object, which just means that if you want to look up the help for these functions, you'd actually want to look up predict.sdmTMB or residuals.sdmTMB. When you call the predict function, that's the actual function that it's finding. Okay, Lewis, there,
A few more questions coming in. One was about whether you can have gaps in your time variable, to which I said yes, but you have to be a bit careful about how you then standardize your time variable. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
yeah, so it depends on how you're structuring your model. If you are assuming we're talking about a spatiotemporal model with random fields, if you're letting those random fields be independent, then there's really nothing special you have to do. But if you were, say, having them as an AR1 process or a random walk process, then by default, it's just going to assume that each subsequent time step is sort of evenly spaced. However, you can pad that. So there's an argument, I think we're not going to get into that this week, and we'll probably get into this next week, but there's an argument extra time. So if you just apply any of the missing years, then it will sort of integrate over those missing years so that the AR1 process is even with years. A good question.
Great. And another good question. Can you predict on data that has missing covariates? For example, you're training your model using sea surface temperature as a covariate, but you don't have the value of sea surface temperature at those locations, at some locations.
Yeah, there's no built-in functionality for that. You'd have to do some kind of your own work outside to impute what the values might be if you wanted to go that approach. I mean, I think another approach, if you didn't have them to predict with, might be to not use it as an explicit covariate and to just use the random field to suck up that variation. And that is sort of an approach that is often taken to avoid the complexity of trying to match the covariate data between what you're fitting and predicting on. So yeah, no built-in imputation.
Great. Can spatiotemporal random fields be correlated over time in relation to another variable?
Yes, but we're going to talk about that next week. Yeah.
Yes, that's in the advanced features section. Can you use higher AR instead of AR1?
No, I mean, yeah, it's not coded in the model. Theoretically, I'm sure you could, but not available.
Great, I think that's all in the queue.
So for the next hour or so, Felina and I are going to be talking about two different examples of using sdmTMB for real data. Let's see here. Okay, so the first example that I'm talking about is going to be an application of sdmTMB to a simple spatial model. This data set is included in the SPATstat library in R, and it's called the BEI data set. It's a data set that just consists of, it's a data frame that just consists of two columns, X and Y, which are locations. And what this data set is actually representing is one of the kind of classical data sets in ecology and thinking about species diversity. And so for anybody who's familiar with Hubble's kind of unified neutral theory of biodiversity, this is the tree data that a lot of that theory is based on. And so these are locations of individual trees measured on the island of Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. So this is a spatial model only. We don't have a time dimension associated with it. And we don't have any other features associated with this particular version of the data. So we don't have any external covariates like latitude, and we don't have any other identifying features of the trees, things like heights or species that might be interesting to model. So we just have these are pure locations. You can think about this in like a presence absence modeling setting. These are presence only data. And these data are useful as an example because they're also widely used in R-INLA manuals and other R vignettes like in the SPATstat library. So if we take our raw observations, I think one of the things that people do with these types of data that are presence-only data is that we can grid them, put them on a lattice. And so I talked about different kinds of data that we might encounter when we're working with spatial models. And georeference data are certainly one of the more common ones that we work with. But the sdmTMB approach also includes the functionality to model lattice data. And so in this case, we have, we're going to take our raw X and Y locations. We're going to grid them, create this equally spaced lattice of grids of equal size. And then we're just accumulating the number of trees as the response in each of those different grid cells. And that's really what we're going to be fitting a model to, is fitting a spatial model to the number of trees in each cell. We can see that there's a number of blank trees here, or blank locations here, where cells are presumably surveyed, but there's no trees. Those are the white cells. And then we have, every other color here just represents the number of trees. So I think one of the, in terms of the workflow, and this came up in the chat, one of the basic questions we want to ask when we first have a data set like this is, should we even think about using a spatial model? And so there are a number of ways to diagnose this. I think one of the more common ones are statistics such as the Moran's I statistic. There's a lot of different flavors of this statistic, but this is the simplest one. And it's included in the APE package in R. What we can do is take our data, calculate the Moran's I statistic, testing for spatial structure in our observations. And this is the p-value here at the bottom, reports a significant finding, less than 0.05, which implies that there is spatial structure, spatial autocorrelation in the data that needs to be accounted for. There's a number of other ways that you could do this. I think another approach would be to fit, use a model in GLS or similar, where we can fit a regression type model with a spatial covariance function and look at for example, the range of that to see if that's would support a large range would imply that there would be spatial correlation that would need to be measured. Okay, so the next decision is what kind of data or what kind of family should we be used to model the response for the number of trees in each of our grid cells. These are data that are a little bit complicated to think about. They are counts. They are a distribution that's fairly skewed. And complicating measures, because these were presence-only data, we're not treating the cells without observations as real zeros. We're truncating them and not including zeros. So this is a zero truncated, positively skewed count distribution. There's a large number of ways that you can think about modeling this. A point process is probably the best, and this could be done in a complicated way using a Poisson distribution and using the weights argument in sdmTMB. We can probably talk about that next week. For simplicity, we could just pretend that our data actually included those zeros, and we could model this using a negative binomial response as the n binom 2 argument or family in sdmTMB. But I wanted to highlight that sdmTMB also has several additional families that allow us to actually work with this this censored data, it's zero truncated or censored data. And so specifically, I'll be using this truncated n binom 2 model, which is going to be zero truncated, only modeling those positive counts. So the third thing we want to think about is creating our mesh. And so in our grids, in our lattice data that I displayed, we have about 200 grid cells total. And so when we create our first mesh, sorry about that, I think some mouse issues. When we create our mesh, we specify our data as dat to this make mesh function. We specify the names of our data frame that include that XY data. and then the cutoff distance, which is the minimum distance between two locations. And I think that you can play around with different values of what this cutoff could be. For any different mesh, we can extract the numbers of vertices or knots out of the mesh object with mesh is the name of my mesh, but mesh $n. So you could, any other object, this could be, obj $mesh $n if obj was the name of your mesh. But in this case, we have 78 vertices or knots. Remember I said that it's good practice to have this being less than the number of total observations. If we have 200 grid cells, this is probably a reasonable approximation for that surface that we're trying to estimate. If we want to plot what that mesh looks like, we can make a simple plot just with plot mesh. So this is what that cell looks like. One of the other questions that came up earlier was about whether it's important to create a mesh with equal sized triangles. We can see in the region where we don't have any data, or the regions certainly on the boundary, these triangles typically are larger and not equally sized. A fancier way to plot the mesh is to use the GG function in the R-INLA brew package. And so this is something that uses ggplot to basically plot these meshes. We can overlay our data. And so this is the number of trees on our mesh as a little bit fancier way to display that. And then we want to think about fitting our first model. And so as I said before, we're using this truncated negative binomial distribution. Our default link is a log link for the negative binomial, and so we're leaving that alone. The other arguments here are just our data and our mesh. And then our formula here, we're just modeling the number of trees, and we don't have any covariates. So it's a very simple formula with just an intercept. Once we fit our model, we can then inspect it by using the summary argument. And so just like GLM, sdmTMB has a summary function. And so what this function will create is it'll tell us that, that this model is fit by sdmTMB. It will give us the formula and the mesh and the name of the data that was used, as well as the family that was used as the response. It will, just like GLM or GAMs, it will also output all of the fixed effects coefficients. And so in this case, we just have a single intercept that we're estimating. It'll report the maximum likelihood estimate of that parameter in addition to the standard error. And then it will report some of the spatial information. And so the dispersion parameter is the dispersion parameter associated with a negative binomial distribution. If you were fitting a Gaussian or normal error, you would get a standard deviation of that error instead. We also get the Matern range, which is it's the distance at which the correlation between 2 points decreases to about 0.1. And so in this case, this is interpreted in terms of units as the original data. So if the original data are in kilometers, this would be interpreted in terms of kilometers. And the spatial standard deviation is the parameter that controls the magnitude or the peakiness of the spatial field that we're estimating. So our fitted model object, which is called fit here, can be passed in and also to the tidy functions. So we can get tidy values of our intercept by just passing it tidy values of the fixed effects by passing in our fitted object. We can specify instead our effects are the random parameters. In this case, this would involve our range estimate. Phi is the over dispersion parameter for the negative binomial, where sigma O is that variation for the spatial field. We can also specify whether we want confidence intervals for all of these parameters. And so by default, this is false, but we can specify, sorry, mouse issues, specify that confident equals true and return confidence intervals for each of those spatial parameters. And maybe the last thing we want to do is make predictions on, I guess, thinking about making predictions with our fitted model the same way we would with, GLMMs and GAMs and other types of models out there. So sdmTMB has a predict function, just like other packages. And when we, maybe the easiest way to do a prediction initially is to predict, look at the predictions for the raw data set that's also being used to fit the model. And so in this case, we can, if we specify predict with no other arguments other than our fitted model object, then we just get back predictions at those locations of our individual as the raw data. And so in this case, we can just create that to a tibble, and we get out the locations X and Y of the data. The estimate is the total overall estimate. The estimate est non-RF is the estimate of the fixed effects that don't include the random field. Est RF is the value of the random field. And in this simple case, with just a simple spatial field, omega s is the same as est RF. So those are redundant. Here's again what those parameters actually mean. I think it's important to note that est column represents the overall estimate, overall prediction in link space. And so in this case, there's a typo on this, or I'm sorry, there's a typo on the slide. It shouldn't be log, it should be log. Log space for the truncated negative binomial. The est non-RF is the estimate of the non-random field components. And so these are the fixed effects in the model. Est RF is the estimate of the random field components, and then omega s is the spatial random field. If we fit a spatiotemporal model, as Felina will show, we'll get different estimates out for the est RF and the omega s arguments. Okay, so that was an example of making predictions using the original data. The other thing we can do is make predictions on a new data set. And so in this case, we want to think about making predictions to our entire region for all grid cells, including cells without any trees. And so in this case, the first thing we need to do is create a data frame that has the same names as the original data. And so in this case, I'm using the expand.grid function to create a data set that has all possible combinations of X and Y as the original data. So I'm projecting to the entire lattice that represents the entire domain of that data. So the new data argument is something that we didn't use before when we were predicting to our original data. In this case, we use new data just like we would with other functions in R, but we specify new data to be our new data frame. And then we can extract all kinds of interesting things here. One of the non-interesting things would be to just plot your estimated non-random field. So for this type of model, as I said before, we're just fitting the intercept only model. So when we look at what that value is over space, we just get this big blue blob, which is of all equal values. And this is because this is just the intercept across the entire area. So not very interesting. But next, what we can pull out is omega s, which is the spatial random field. This is the spatial, the latent spatial process that is approximating the number of trees over the surface. This, remember, is also going to be in link space, so this is in log space. But these correspond to, we can see that the area in deepest, darkest red corresponds to those grid cells without any trees, which is consistent with the actual data. We can then visualize our predictions, the total predictions in link space. So the total predictions include, for this model, include our spatial random field, as I showed on the last slide, plus the intercept. And so again, the total of these represents the number of trees, the estimated number of trees in log space, with colors that are in yellow corresponding to high numbers of trees, and colors in purple corresponding to low numbers of trees. We've overlaid the actual raw data here too, just to visually show that there is correspondence between areas that are predicted to have very few trees actually do have very few trees. Okay, and lastly, I think that what we might want to do is take our predictions that were in link space in this log space here, and convert them back to regular space or normal space so that we can interpret them on the scale of the original data. And so in this case, we're just changing our fill argument here from est, which was the predictions in link space, to be exponentiated. And then we get the raw predicted numbers of trees for each of these different cells. So that's the simple kind of overview of the simplest possible model that we can fit using sdmTMB. This was a spatial only model without any covariates, so not very interesting, but hopefully there's enough code here and plotting code to kind of get you started in thinking about other applications. And I'm going to turn it over to Felina to talk about an example that includes some other spatiotemporal models and covariates. Should we take, why don't we take any, does anybody have questions about that application before Felina takes over? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So let's, yeah, Felina, why don't you?
Sorry, there were one question in the chat about aerial applications to aerial data. So very briefly, yes, you can apply these models to that type of data. There's some small nuances to it that you can read about in the doc.
Okay, now we're going to get into some fish. So this example is going to use a data set that comes with the SDMTMB package. So it's a handy one to play with and experiment with. And it is Pacific cod data from Queen Charlotte Sound off British Columbia. And you can see once you've loaded the necessary packages that the PCOD is the name of the data set. So that data frame will be there. And it contains year, XY variables, which are already in the UTM kilometer units, depth, density, so that's a biomass density. I believe it's kilograms per kilometer squared, and a presence absence variable. Next slide. And so we can feed this PCOD data frame into the make mesh function, telling it that the XY columns are coordinates, and using a cutoff of 10, which would be 10 kilometers. And we get a mesh that would look like this. Next slide. So to make a simple spatial model out of this, use this mesh, and we're going to stick with just a presence absence model to start with, and intercept only, so no covariates with the PCOD data. And then because it's presence absence, we'd need a binomial family, and the default would be for the spatial field to be on. Next slide. However, maybe we should include depth. And so you can take the fit from that original model without depth and compare it with the depth variable in that data frame and see that the spatial field is capturing some of the variation in depth. So those predictions do follow. This is just a GAM line plotted against this. So that the spatial random field does capture some of the variation with respect to depth, but it would probably be better to actually use depth as a fixed effect in the model. So we can try that. Next slide. So in this case, we're going to try poly of log depth, and in many cases, log depth fits better than raw depth. You could also make quadratic relationship yourself, or use the S-smoother GAM style to do this prediction. And still we will retain the spatial field to capture spatial correlation that is not due to depth. Next slide. So the output of this model, so you saw before you could put summary around fit. You'll get the same thing if you just print the model name. So in this case, it was fit. And it tells you this is a spatial model fit by sdmTMB. The formula, which is the presence with a polynomial effective log depth, second order polynomial, and binomial family. And the coefficients and the standard error are reported. These are not exactly what you'd see if you fed in your quadratic variables manually, but the prediction would actually come out the same. And then the spatial range parameter suggests correlation extends to about 43 kilometers, and the spatial standard deviation is the peakiness again. Next slide. So to extract the parameters from this model, you can use the tidy function, and that would give you the effects for depth. And once again, tidy with effects equal ran pars gives you the random parameter effects. Because they're in log space, they don't report the standard error there, but by adding confidence intervals equal true, or conf.int equals true, you get the confidence interval. So you can see the range of values estimated in the model. The range is actually somewhere between 28 and 66 kilometers. And then if you just use predict with no other arguments, we can get the predictions for the original data points. And the output variables are est, which again is in link space. This time it is truly a logit link because we've used a binomial family. The estimates for the fixed effects, which in this case is just depth and the intercept, and the estimated effect of all the random field components. In this case, we just have the one, and the omega s is that one random field component. So if we wanted to predict for locations where we haven't sampled, we need a new grid. And so along with the PCOD data frame, SDMTMB comes with the QCS grid, which is a grid that defines the survey area for the Queen Charlotte Sound Synoptic Trawl Survey. And so this covers the full survey domain, and it includes the depth variable that you can see here plotted for just 1 year of the data frame. So the data frame is also replicated for each year in the data set. And you would need to do that if you have a grid of any kind. It needs to be replicated with the year variable and any other variables in your model. So you can feed this new data into the predict function and you can plot it. And so this plogis transforms the estimate into the space of actual prediction we're looking for, which is the probability that PCOD are found at these particular locations. Next slide. For the non-random effects, so this is just the effect of depth. So based on depth alone, this is how much of the probability, how likely that PCOD would be caught at these locations. And then the spatial random field. So this is the variation not explained by depth that is predicted by our random field. So now we might want to plot what the effective depth is. So once again, you can create new data that just specifies depth and feed that in to our predict function. And if you want confidence intervals, you'll need to put SE fit equals true. And the RE form described this way prevents it from including the spatial random fields. And so it doesn't require you to have those spatial variables in your new data frame. And this would be the effect of depth from this model, plotted with its standard errors. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Sean to get into the spatial temporal model.
All right, thanks, Felina. So just as a reminder, this is what the data set looked like. So we've got year, UTM coordinates in kilometers, depth, density, and presence absence. So up until this point, this is the model that Felina was describing. It's a spatial model with a binomial family of presence absence. And now for the second, little more complicated example, we're going to switch this to density. And when we switch it to density, we're going to have to switch the family to something other than binomial, and the Tweety would work well here because it's data that is continuous and positive, but also has some zeros. And if we want to go from the spatial to a spatiotemporal, to go back and forth between these two, all we have to do is specify the year column, the time column in our data set, which is year here. And the default spatiotemporal would be independent IID. I'm just showing it here for clarity. And in this example, I'm also tweaking how the main effects are specified, just to show another example. So here, instead of using a quadratic polynomial, we're using a smoother, and I've just limited from the default basis dimension and put k equals 5, just so it fits a little bit faster. Camera's off. Good point. Okay, camera's on. And a common way to set up these models, if you're going to use it for index standardization, is to have an independent factor for every year. So we're estimating the mean for each year independent of each other. And so a way we can do that is by specifying as dot factor year. And we've put a 0 in there. It could also be -1. And that just means that we're going to have a mean for every single year. If I didn't have the 0 in there, then we'd have an intercept, and every year after the first year would be an offset from that, a deviation from that first year. So we've got a smoother effective depth. I've limited the wiggliness a little bit, makes the model a little faster to fit. And I've specified time, and I've written out spatiotemporal equals IID just to be really pedantic about what's happening here. And I've also turned off the silent. So when silent is off, then you're seeing the optimization progress from TMB and the NLM-INB optimization function. Totally optional, but when we start fitting models that take longer to fit, sometimes it can be helpful to be able to monitor the progress and see what's happening rather than just sitting there and staring at a blank page for a few minutes. So we fit that model. Depending on your computer, my guess is that might have taken somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute. And this is what we get out of it. A couple things that are different from before. One at the top, this says spatiotemporal model, because now there's a time element. It tells you what the time column is. It has a section where it displays all the fixed effects, and I've just cut off some of those here because there's a whole bunch of them, and I'll go off the bottom of the page. But at the bottom, now we have a spatiotemporal standard deviation. And importantly, the range parameter by default is shared between the spatial and spatiotemporal fields. And this is also the way it's done in VAST. And I think this is just because the spatial range is a hard parameter to estimate, and there's not a lot of information in the data about it. And so it helps often to share that parameter between the two fields. If you work through the exercise that we've created and linked to after today, there's an exercise in there where you can try letting the range be estimated independently between the two fields. There's just a share range argument. So right now that range is sort of averaged across the two fields. and we can look at the relative magnitude. So in this case, the spatial and spatiotemporal standard deviation are quite similar in this case, but that may not be the case in all models. So one of the things that we can get out of the model is residuals, and the residuals that are built into the residuals method, so residuals.sdmTMB, are randomized quantile residuals. And this helps visualize residuals even for distributions where you have integer values, or for binomial data, or in this case where you have some zeros. So it adds a randomized component to the residual, and then it transforms it so that if it were, if the distribution were consistent with the data, they would resemble a Gaussian distribution. So the residuals would be Gaussian in the end. It's done some transformations internally. It's actually quite tricky, and this is kind of an open area of research to get good residuals out of these types of models. And so it's known that these residuals can actually look not great, even if the model is perfect. There's some other options for residuals, and we'll talk about that next week. And in particular, there is a vignette that's linked to right here, and that goes through all the different kinds of residuals that you can calculate, and talks about the benefits and pros and cons of the various types of residuals that you can calculate. But we're just going to use the most simple types of residuals here this week, which is these randomized quantile residuals, sort of naive and not dealing with problems with Laplace approximation and random effects. And we're just going to use the QQ norm function and QQ line to plot them out, and they look reasonably good here. We can also plot our residuals in space. So here I've just picked out 2 years because to show all the years would be hard to put on the slide. But if I take the output from residuals and I save it into a column of my original data, and then I just plot my residuals in X and Y, we can plot them out in space, and we can look visually, which is probably the most important thing to do here, to see whether we see remaining correlation spatially. And there's also some tests. We could run the Moran's eye on this. Next week, we can look at some of the ways you can test this with the Dharma package. But as a first pass, probably the most important thing is just to plot your residuals spatially and look for remaining patterns. And this looks pretty good to me. So as we've done before, we can predict on a grid that covers the entire region of interest. And we're going to use, again, that Queen Charlotte Sound grid, QCS grid that's built into SDMTMB. And the output is going to be the same with the addition of one more column that's not going to be all zeros now, which is the epsilon ST, which is the spatiotemporal random field estimates. This is following the notation that's also used in VAST, which is why we use omega and epsilon. But if you have trouble remembering what omega and epsilon are, you can look at the subscripts. So the subscript S is the spatial field, the subscript ST is the spatiotemporal fields. And I'll plot out those various components now. So these are the predictions in natural space. So they've been the inverse link, the exponential function has been applied. It looks fairly constantly blue just because there's a hotspot right here that's sort of distorting the color scale. I've used a square root transformation to somewhat help with that. We could also look at it in a log space. This is the non-random field component. So this includes an annual year effect, which is why some years are overall higher or lower in this plot. And it also includes the smoother for depth. So it's a depth effect and a year effect that we're seeing here. And here are those spatial random effects, random field, and you'll note that they are the same every year because the spatial random field by definition is a constant random field. But if we look at epsilon ST, the spatiotemporal random field, we've set it up as IID. And so we've set it up, so what we see here are that these fields are independent from each year. So this is spatial correlation remaining in the model that is independent for each year. So this might, things that might be contributing to this would be things like bottom temperature, year, salinity, pH, other predators, prey, other things that are changing year to year. So not something like depth, but that's causing spatial correlation in the model, but it's changing year to year. So just touching on one sort of more advanced thing we can do, because I think it's quite useful, is that there's a argument nsim, which effectively takes draws from the multivariate normal covariance matrix in the internal transform space, which is actually taking draws from the joint precision matrix, which is a fancy way of saying that it's basically taking draws from the parameters and their full covariance space. And we can use those draws to quickly calculate things. And one of the things we can quickly calculate would be the standard deviation of them. So this is getting our standard error in space. So I've used the predict function with my new data. I've given it nsim. I've said I want 500 draws. What I get out of it is just a matrix, and each row is for a row of my original data, and each column is for one of my draws, so there's 500. I'm just showing the first 3 rows and the first 4 columns here. And I can do anything I want with this matrix. So in this case, I'm just going to apply over the rows to calculate the standard deviation. So I'm taking the standard deviation across each row. And I plot that out here for 3 years. We can see, a measure of uncertainty now in space. And you'll also note that this uncertainty is somewhat driven by the mesh approximation, how it gets higher and lower depending on where you are with respect to a node. So the last thing we'll touch on in this example and this week is some of the derived quantities that you can get out of this. So this is one of the main reasons that we sort of wrote this package in the first place. And this is one of the things that VAST does as well. And one of the advantages of using this kind of tool over something like MGCV, where it's a little harder to calculate these derived quantities after the fact, including all the uncertainty. And one of the common things people want to do often is to come up with a standardized population index of abundance or biomass. And we can do that fairly simply with a model that we've already fit. And there's a couple ways to do that. We're going to show just the simplest way right now, which is that we're just going to predict from our model over the entire survey grid. We're going to tell it that the area of each grid cell is 4. And if the grid cells were not always equal to 4, like if there was land over some of the grid cells, this could be a vector of areas. By default, it just extends this to the entire data set. And importantly, if we're going to use this approach, then we need to say return TMB object equals true, which just includes some of the TMB internal structure that's needed for the next function. So we save that to P2, and then we just use the function getIndex on our predictions. And all this is going to do is internally in the model, it's going to go in and it's going to sum up the biomass in every single grid cell and then calculate for each year, and then it's going to calculate uncertainty on that sum across all the grid cells for each year using the generalized delta method. And by default, bias correct is false, and that'll be much, much faster. That's all we're showing here. That's known to be somewhat biased because of the nonlinear transformation on the random effects. And so if I was using this in a stock assessment, I would want to set bias correct equals true for my final model run, which takes longer to run, but it should correct for that bias. There's other options as well that we've been working on that are faster, but that's probably the most standard approach right now. And here I'm just plotting that index. I'm showing the estimate and then a confidence interval around it over time. The other derived quantity that people often calculate with these models is the center of gravity. So this is basically an average X and Y, or latitude, longitude, weighted by biomass density or numbers of fish. So in this case, it's weighted by biomass density. And to do that, we just use get COG for get center of gravity. Similar format to before. I've said format equals wide just because it gives me a data frame that's wide format, which makes it easier to pass into ggplot. Otherwise, it creates a long format data frame. And I've plotted it out. So the center of each X here is the estimate, and then we've got the 95% confidence interval in X coordinates and Y coordinates over time. So we could use this to look at, do we think that a species might be moving its range center over time? Is there a range shift? I just saw that there was a question about, should this be biomass density on the y-axis? And no, because we've given it the area. So the original one was per, I assume it was per kilometer squared, and so it's now being, the 4 is a 2 by 2 kilometer grid cell, and so when it's being multiplied by the area, we've now end up with our biomass estimate, not accounting for catchability of the survey. Okay, that's all we have for this set of slides. Were there questions you want to field right now, Lewis?
There were several questions. Let's see. This was a good question. If the estimated range is smaller than the cutoff used for the mesh, does it mean we should use a finer mesh with a smaller cutoff?
Yes, although for the most part, I think the model would not converge very well if that were the case, because it's really hard to estimate the range if it doesn't have multiple knots to estimate that decay of correlation. So it probably just wouldn't converge.
And another sort of nuanced question. Can predictions be made with any fixed or random effects turned on or off?
Basically, so we include sort of the most common ones that we think you might want in the prediction data frame. So you've got everything that's not a random field summed up. You've got everything that is a random field summed up. You've got the spatial random fields, and you've got the spatiotemporal random fields. So you could mix and match that however you like. You could add them up yourself afterwards because it's in link space. So like if I wanted to exclude the spatial random fields, I could add the non-random field component to the spatiotemporal field component, and that would be that estimate.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I botched the delivery of the question a little bit. There was a sub question, which is how do you get the standard errors for all these different prediction categories?
Not super easily right now. They're quite expensive to calculate, and so they're often not calculated. The fastest way we found is with those draws from the joint precision matrix, and there is functionality within there to choose what variable you're getting the draws from. So it is possible, but it's more advanced. I think there is actually an example of that in one of the appendices for the paper, the one with the bird count appendix. So possible, but a bit trickier.
Awesome, great. I think that's good for now. Should probably move on for the sake of time.
So we're just going to finish off with sort of discussing some related packages and then some tips and tricks on troubleshooting, and particularly assessing convergence of these models. So first, where to get help. If you haven't clicked this already, I'll just click over and show you some of the various places. The main GitHub repository is PBSSS sdmTMB, and in there is among other things, a long README that has a lot of different examples. And next week's advanced topics will cover some of these more advanced topics beyond the basic use. If we go to the documentation file site, so this is sort of a rendered version of that GitHub repository. So first it has all of the README, the same README you saw before. It also has all of the help files rendered here under reference. So if I went to, say, sdmTMB, I would see that and all the stuff you would get if you did !sdmTMB. And the examples themselves are rendered as well. And of particular use is probably the articles. So these are the rendered vignettes. So there's there's an introduction one on fitting delta models, so two-part models, like a binomial and a gamma model, and combining them. There's an index standardization one, which is quite similar to what the last example that was shown was. There's the model description, which has all the sort of math and details behind the optimization and parameterizations. There's one on how to make pretty maps dealing with UTMs and prediction output, probably helpful more generally than just sdmTMB. There's a vignette on residual checking, all the different kinds of residuals you can get. There's one on fitting spatial trend models, which is a type of spatially varying coefficient or slope. And there's one on the threshold style fitting of the breakpoints or logistic models. So that is a good place to go. If you have new features to suggest, bugs, the issue tracker would be the place to go. And Lewis has been compiling over here on the wiki over the last couple of weeks some helpful links to papers and websites on various aspects of R-INLA and these types of models and literature that uses these types of models or sdmTMB. In the linked draft paper that we supplied, there's this particular table, which is probably better viewed in the PDF itself, but it's comparing the functionality between some related packages, so sdmTMB and VAST. They can fit many of the identical models, and we have in one of the appendices comparing VAST to sdmTMB, showing you can get the exact same output. Similarly, we have an appendix showing fitting the same models with R-INLA or R-INLA brew and sdmTMB. They can also fit many of the identical models with a different fitting routine. And then there's MGCV here, there's SP-Bayes, which is a common Bayesian spatial R package, and there's a package SPAMM, spatial mixed effects modeling, I think. And it can only fit spatial models, but it can fit some of these same models with an SBDE approach, and so we've included in the table. The point here is there's lots of little differences in what certain packages can fit, so it, depending what you're trying to fit, you may be having to look at a certain package. Some of the difference between them is in what they can fit, but there's also a really big difference in the interface between them, and that was a large part of why we have been working on sdmTMB, because we wanted to make something that was a little more accessible for fitting these kind of complex and useful models. If you look at the appendices in the paper, you can see some examples of the type of things you have to do to fit the same models, say with R-INLA versus sdmTMB. I'll highlight one of the major differences of the sdmTMB or VAST over R-INLA is that you can fit anisotropy. So there's an anisotropy argument that lets the spatial correlation decay differently in the two different directions, which, especially for people, at least on the West Coast of North America, that's often the case with our surveys where you have this shelf, a fairly thin survey with a shelf and a steep drop off. So you might think that the correlation would be different up and down the coast versus off the coast. And you can do that with the template model builder base packages, sdmTMB and VAST. So sdmTMB fits a variety of models. It really focuses on univariate responses, the type of thing you might fit with like a GLM or GLMM TMB. But it does not focus on multivariate models, which VAST does. It does not focus on spatial factor analysis or spatial dynamic factor analysis, which VAST does. It also doesn't have built-in two-part delta, hurdle, or zero inflated models, but these can be fit as two parts and combined, and there's a vignette on that. In terms of troubleshooting, probably the most important thing to understand is that these models are really complex, and it's very easy to set up a model that won't converge. Here's an example of a model, very similar to what we fit before, but we've just included an interaction of year and depth. And we get this warning message that the model may not have converged, non-positive definite Hessian matrix. So who is Hessian and why are they not converged? Hessian matrix is a matrix of second derivatives of a function. Here, the negative log likelihood surface. And the inverse of the negative Hessian is the parameter covariance matrix. So this warning basically just means that the curvature of the log likelihood surface is not consistent with the model having converged or found the best fit for the parameters. So we have a problem. And we'll talk about some ways we might be able to solve that, but generally it means is that it might be over-parameterized in some way, or some variance parameter might have fallen right to zero. There's a great vignette in the GLMMTMB package on troubleshooting, which goes into depth on all sorts of problems that you can end up with TMB models, and basically everything you see there is also applicable here. So if we were to inspect that model where we had that warning, we would also see that there's an NAN value for the standard error on the interaction term. Or we could also look just at the SD report. So this is something, the standard deviation report is something that comes back out of TMB. And in this case, we could get the information just from looking at the print output. But if, for example, it was the range parameter or the spatial standard deviation that had not converged, we wouldn't necessarily see that here because the standard error isn't actually printed in this particular output. So the SD report is a more sort of raw viewing of all of the fixed effect parameters in this default view and their standard errors. And we also see that the fourth BJ or beta J parameter is NA, and that corresponds to what we see here. The fourth parameter is the interaction. And at the bottom of this, it also notes the maximum gradient component, which we could also calculate for our model. It's from an element called gradients in our fit. And this is the gradient with respect to the fixed parameters. So we're looking at the maximum one is 6.9, which is quite large here. So the gradient becomes smaller as the likelihood surface becomes flatter at the location in parameter space that you are. Flatter surface is closer to the point of maximum likelihood, so small values are consistent with convergence. No hard rule, but smaller is better. Say perhaps less than 0.01 or 0.001. This is definitely too big. So we have a problem, and the interpretation in this case would be that the interaction term seems tricky to estimate. And possible solutions might be make sure the model is identifiable. Like, do you have the data to actually estimate what you're asking? Maybe if you have a factor variable, are there two factors that represent the same level so that you can't actually identify the model? We could drop the linear interaction. Maybe the interaction isn't all that important here. In some cases, it could be because the predictors are just way too big or way too small in scale, and so the optimizer is having problems finding the best values. So we could rescale them so that they're roughly standard normal, like have a standard deviation of roughly 1. We could try different mesh setup. So the mesh setup can affect convergence, and particularly if the mesh is way too coarse or sometimes way too fine, or even just slightly tweaking the mesh, that can affect convergence when the model gets tricky to estimate. We could simplify some other part of the model, like maybe turning off spatiotemporal fields if we had them. Or we could try a related fixed effect structure that gets us to somewhere similar. So that's just an example we'll show on the next slide here. So maybe instead of what we did before with the interaction, we might have a smoother for depth, and we're creating a factor variable for year, and we're saying the smoother for depth varies by year. And in this case, this model does converge. There's other warnings that you might get, in particular warnings about the matrix package version and TMB, which can generally be ignored, but there's lots more about this on the GLMMTMB site. And for more esoteric TMB problems, there's the TMB users forum on the Google groups. So just to finish this off with some sort of higher level words of wisdom from having worked with these models a fair bit now. Start simple for sure. These are really complex models. If you're used to fitting simple GLMs or even a lot of GLMMs, these are way more complicated, and it's quite easy to set up a model that will not converge. They can take a while to fit, so help yourself out and say silent equals false so you can see progress and you're not just sitting there waiting to see what's going to happen. And they can also be really hard to wrap your head around, so don't feel bad about that at first. If you're not used to thinking about sort of the paradigms we've been talking about, this may seem tricky at first, but it's a really powerful way to think about these types of data. Some options for starting simple. You could start with just intercept only and no covariates and work from there, like what we did with the Pacific Cod dataset. The tree dataset was also just fit with an intercept. We could start with a spatial model and not have a spatiotemporal component. We could even start without any random fields, and then we just have a straight GLM. So if we set spatial off and spatiotemporal off, we just have a regular old GLM. And generally, it's good practice to start with a coarser mesh so you can experiment relatively quickly and maybe increase the resolution of the mesh later when you have a final model that you like, because the mesh resolution greatly impacts speed, and finer is not always better. At some level of fineness, you can actually start to overfit the data, and it can affect convergence. More words of wisdom: make lots of plots, plot the raw data, plot the predictions, plot the random fields like we have been doing. Don't get too caught up in the model configuration. There's many of these configurations, for example, whether something is AR1 or independent or random walk, they're very subtly different from each other, and they can produce very similar predictions. Consider the scale of the response and the predictors. Make sure none of the parameters are way too big or way too small. So we worked in kilometers, for example, and we made sure none of our predictors were really, really tiny or really big in scale. And as Eric noted in the first set of slides, consider if observation variance dwarfs the process variance, because this can make these kind of state space models really hard to estimate. So we've tried to give you sort of a complete introduction to these types of models today, but there's lots of stuff that we didn't cover today. Simulation, other kinds of residuals, time varying coefficients, spatially varying coefficients, interpolation over missing years, forecasting, priors or penalties, cross-validation that's built in, Bayesian sampling with STAN and TMB STAN, and dealing with correlation boundaries. So not wanting correlation, say, to go across an island or a peninsula. And these are some of those functions that help, or arguments that help with these various topics. And hopefully next week we will touch on many of these topics. And with that, I think we'll stop and field any questions.
Not much else happening in the Google Doc, but people can feel free to chime in. While folks are thinking about that, there was some chatter about whether and how to apply these types of models to fishery-dependent catch data. Provided some links that people should look at for that. Essentially, the process would be the same, but we don't have anything built in currently to account for preferential sampling that occurs with fishery-dependent data. But there is a literature on that more generally.
It's a pretty important point, I guess, that we probably hadn't made yet, which is one of the most fundamental assumptions of any kind of this type of spatial model is that the sampling locations are independent of the response. If you just think through the logic of it, if you were only sampling where you think there's lots of Pacific cod, then of course your view over the entire region is going to be quite skewed. And that is effectively what you have with fishery-dependent data. The hard problem.